My name is Karolina. I represent the Wonderlarp Foundation, and this topic of inclusive LARPing, so accessibility, representation, and safety, came up because it's a very hot topic when it comes to the international LARP scene, especially, and people have been trying to make LARPs more inclusive for a long, long time in various different fields, and we're still a long way ahead from making LARPs accessible financially because of the rise of blockbuster LARPs, because of the rise of inflation across the world, and just a worsening financial situation of many, many countries compared to the others. But I did a little bit of research while preparing for this topic, and I asked LARPers in various cultures how they perceive accessibility as a whole without going into details of the types of accessibility, and whether they think that it's on the rise or that it's worsening. And the overwhelming majority actually said that LARPs are becoming more accessible if we exclude the financial part, meaning that more and more organizers are paying attention to neurodivergence, for instance, and trying to cater to that, to people with certain mobility issues, and they're looking for venues that will accommodate that. And also they are employing safety people who are responsible for making sure that the participants are being taken care of emotionally during and after the game, which was not the standard at all a few years ago, and which is still something that Polish LARPs, for instance, are still way behind on. And safety, just like player care people or safety people, are still kind of an afterthought, at least in our culture, a little bit. So I guess my first question would be, what does inclusivity mean just in the general context of LARP, and how can organizers and participants work towards making LARPs inclusive for all? So how do you think, how would you understand inclusivity in this area?
For me, the first question is, or the first thought that comes to my mind is that attempting to include as many people as possible is nice, but the ideal of including everybody is not possible. Just by virtue of by accommodating for certain people, you automatically exclude other people. It's sadly how things work. Yeah. Plus, if you have to take care of certain needs, you also exclude yourself certain options when it comes to, for example, venue or food or whatever else. So I love the idea of like making a LARP successful for as many people as you want. You need to make very clear choices on which people and which groups you take and which people you don't take, because you cannot include everybody.
Yeah. And one example that was given in this area was that if we wanted to include people with, let's say, mobility issues, we would have to stop making LARPs in like medieval castles, because it's not possible for people, for instance, in wheelchairs or with other mobility issues, to use those ancient staircases and just climb all the way to actually access the LARP area.
And
which
actually, even mentioning something like this, we could also say something like, in, for example, medieval times, in like forts, castles, or any places like this, those places weren't adjusted for such kind of person, because such kind of person would not be in the fort, for example, right? So some people might say, okay, inclusivity. Okay, for example, for disabled people, for people that has mobility issues, right? But on the other hand, some people might say it's breaking the immersion, right? Because, for example, they would say in such times, in forts, those places weren't adjusted for that kind of situation, because those people would not be in the fort where soldiers were, for example, right? Just an example. Of course, I'm not overgeneralizing or anything, right? But just kind of example that there might be two sides of a coin.
Yeah, because then basically you give the example of something that puts immersion over accessibility, and I guess it's the organizer's decision, or the organizers combined with participants, what's more important to that game, and whether people in like glasses, modern-looking glasses, are still welcome, or should they invest thousands of euro possibly to get all of the costume up to speed to be even allowed, not to mention like more serious mobility issues or other health issues. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, and the worst thing came late, and the only thing I could do is to relate to the last words that you were. It is actually not like the way you're portraying it. It all depended on the social interaction. Generally, it was told some of the earliest historians of the state, historians of the state, or historians of government, put forward that the moment that showed that we have become a society is that they found the first person with healed brakes. Because actually, when someone breaks in nature, the animal will almost always die. Because it cannot fight, it cannot go for food, and it cannot run away not to become someone's food. And that's what historians said. The first skeletons showing signs of healing and of healed fractures proves that we have become a society. Society stratificates, and generally, if you ask about, let's say, the lower classes that become classes, it was very much in fashion at times. So let's become classes. If you are in a low working class, even if you are a free person, because actually that's one of the lies that is perpetuated. Most of the people in antiquity, in the ancient times, were free. Actually, the idea of enslavement and slavery was a bit later, it was Roman, Greek at that time. But the ancient societies were quite free. Ancient Egypt is one of the best examples. It weren't the slaves who built the pyramids. Actually, there was almost no slave labor for this. Never mind. So, when you were poor and you got a child with disability, you usually kill it. There were various methods. Was it not the little that was the most, let's say, the most accepted was leaving someone to die of hunger or to become eaten by the animals. So usually you took your child, you took it into the forest, and you tried to make another child. So it was like this with the lower classes. The higher classes, it was completely different. When you had a noble, or especially a royal blood, who had some problems, you had to cope with it, because it was the time of the divine right of kings. So when we had someone from the royal family, he couldn't be, let's say,
Taken care of.
Taken care of. Yeah. Apart from Turkey, they had a very specific way of choosing the successor. Yeah, they took one kid, and all the other kids were usually suffocated with.
I don't want to hurry you up.
Yeah.
We are on the topic of inclusivity and you're rambling.
Yes. So coming back, when we have a rich person, it was his disability that proved that he was the important one, that he could order people to move him, for example.
And I completely understand that, and I'm not saying that, for example, like you said, a poor person, like a peasant, for example, against a noble and royal member of the family. And I completely understand that that place could be adjusted for that. I completely understand, and it's reasonable. What I'm saying is like a military fort. Such place, for example, if you're making a battle lab, for example, right? And you're making a battle fort for military, right? For soldiers. That kind of place might not be adjusted for someone with moving disability or any kind of issue like that, right? But of course, if you're talking about a lab, a chamber lab, for example, that is set up in a royal court, that's completely understandable, impossible, right? Because it's not only about inclusivity, but also, like you said, actually accurate with the history, for example. And I completely agree with that. That's what I was saying is two completely different examples, right?
And now, that is what the lawyers usually do. And have you seen a disabled person wishing to participate in a battle lab?
Like I said, I'm not talking about a very specific example, but if we're talking about inclusivity, like for example, we want to inclusive everyone everywhere, for example, right? Then that kind of person might say, I want to experience a lab like this. And it should be up to the organizer how to handle it. So for example, for example, I don't know, a person with a disability issue, or I don't know, on a wheelchair, for example, he says, I want to participate in the battle lab, I want to be a soldier, and it's up to the organizer how to handle this. For example, he might say, might be not very good option for you, or go ahead, and it might cause some kind of disaster. Or he might say, okay, but you'll be, for example, in the camp, handling the camp issues, for example. So I think it's inclusivity is okay, right? But it needs to be handled with care and with thought, like this, right? So it won't cause any kind of disaster. I don't know. It's a very maybe extreme example, but it is example nevertheless.
So some LARP cultures or some LARP organizers actually deal with this by including in their player-facing materials some accessibility guidelines. Yes. So for instance, saying this LARP is going to take place in a medieval castle. There is no elevator, so there are certain accessibility issues. Or for instance, we have no one-person rooms at this LARP. We only have dormitories. So if you have sleeping issues, this may be a problem. Or if you need electricity to function because of your health equipment or something, this LARP unfortunately doesn't have this accommodation. We will not be able to offer you a spot or maybe plan carefully so that it's on the player and not on the organizer to decide whether they can participate safely or not, because we are dealing with adults mostly, or at least we assume that we are creating games for adults or for people who have guardian, some sort of a care. And it's common practice nowadays to kind of divide this responsibility between the organizers, on whom it is like the onus of making sure that the LARP is communicated well when it comes to all the issues, including accessibility ones, and the players who need to decide whether this is actually a game for them. Can I participate if I need a single room, if it needs to be on the ground floor, because I have accessibility issues and I cannot climb 5 stories upwards, or should I just sit this one out? Because if you absolutely must attend a game, is it fair to put it on the organizers to make accommodations for you? especially if they are not a company that gets paid by it, but it's just a bunch of people who do this as a hobby.
I think at that point I'm like, yes. So what I expect to organize from my players is that they communicate prior to being on site and being in game time happening what they need, right? As an organizer, I'm very happy to try and help out and see what we can do. Not everything is possible, but I'm very happy to help out. But what I run into often is players just assuming I will provide an accommodation, not communicating it, and then demanding it once on the pitch. And that is something I don't think is reasonable, because whilst the organizer has a responsibility to make a event as inclusive as they can, the player has the responsibility to communicate the needs that they have prior to the event to allow the organizer to make it as inclusive as they can. Because otherwise you end up with a situation where if everybody would have such an issue, and they all come to the organizer on the day of LARP, the LARP can't run, because there is 150 issues that need to suddenly be resolved. And that is not reasonable, and that is happening way too often.
And I completely agree with it, because sometimes you might have a person that is like a customer and the business, right? So for example, I'm paying, I'm demanding something, right? So this is a good example, because he paid and he thought, he didn't think about some issues that he thought that might be obvious, and then he says an argument like, I'm paying, so I'm demanding. There are kinds of people like this. And then you have an issue like this, like you said, right? There are completely 100 issues that might come up, and it's chaos. So for example, so like you said, it's like we said, it's also up to the person as the player to have to realize also that there might be kind of like issues like this, and they need to think ahead of some things like this.
Yeah, they need to have the foresight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
You can take the time.
No, it's okay. It's just,
No, it's two things. One, regarding to what you said, I think there is a completely huge difference between someone who needs something, usually access to electricity, but it can be access to running water, it can be access to a place to lay down. For example, if you're epileptic, basically it's not very good to be couched on the stairs. It's a completely different thing, because in such persons have to actually be deterred from attending the lab. It's not really enough to say we have problems with electricity. I think you have to do what actually the Polish lines did with one of the stations. There is no help for you then. Do not stop there. Do not come in. And almost in such words. So if someone needs to have, for example, a breathing apparatus switched on, you have to warn him that it is impossible. So because it's much more than a fear of heights. If someone has a fear of heights, we'll find the ground floor room for him, yeah, or something like this. But if someone has to have, because otherwise he might have serious problems, even life-threatening problems, then it has to be addressed. He has to be warned. If something really bad happens, we'll be talking about this in another time, but if something really bad happens, you are answerable for that you haven't warned of danger he didn't expect. Because, for example, if we make a LARP on, let it be very difficult, but in a swamp, we build a village in a swamp. besieged by monsters, then maybe it is clear that there are problems with electricity. But if you just make a lot, it's not clear for the person who is used to have electricity that something like this might happen. So we actually have to warn him about the dangers that are not obvious. You do not have to warn the larpers of the dangers that are obvious. For example, don't jump off the walls. It might be fatal. It might be fatal. But you have to warn them about the dangers which are not obvious. Like, do not enter the cellar. There is no light and the stairs are broken. Yes, or do not catch the light because they might be like lifelines. So that's one thing. You have to warn. And the second thing, have you ever in your practice encountered a larper with a guardian?
With what?
With a guardian.
Yes.
Yes.
Because one of my best students were disabled, and one was extremely disabled, because he was paralyzed generally from the neck down. It meant that when he came for the lectures, a sort of a cage had to be built for him, because he had no tension. So you had to lie him down and put him in this cage and strap him in it. So it took a bit time, and the first time was quite shocking. But otherwise, he was really one of the best students I ever had. And he had a guardian. Could he be a good larper? Of course. But you wouldn't really expect running after the thieves or something like this from him. But if he were to be an oracle, that's a good role. An oracle just lies and says, I see. In the future, tormented death. And that would be a good place. But you have to warn them. Yeah.
Yeah, and vice versa, they have to then communicate beforehand to you, then they have this need, right? Because then as an organizer you have the option to go, oh yes, I can accommodate this, we have a role for you, here you go, would you like this? Right? Because if they don't, and they just sign up and then pass them as something different.
And you see them with their guardian and the cage, and being rolled on some sort of rolling bed actually, then it might be difficult putting it into the scenario very quickly.
So just out of curiosity, have you, either as organizers or as players, encountered any accessibility issues that you weren't prepared for?
Yes. For one of the LARPs we had a individual who needed a carrot to help with things like cutting. They had very this man had a very weak muscles, so he couldn't do a lot of things like gripping and like cutting and like all this. So he needed somebody there to help him with all his everyday tasks, including things like opening doors and stuff, because otherwise he'd be stuck in places. The thing is, he didn't bring a carer and just expected one of the organizers to be with him 24/7.
Oh.
Yeah. And at a certain point, we kind of negotiated with him. We're like, we don't really have anyone spare. Because, as you know, like, LARP is not a hobby where you have a bunch of extra people spare in your organizing team. So we ended up having to say, like, after half a day of trying to accommodate it, we're very sorry, but we can't accommodate this because we're just running short on other things, and we're killing our LARP here because of this, unfortunately. So we had to send them home. And if that had been communicated in advance, we would have at least like tried to find somebody extra that was willing to help him, right? But because it wasn't communicated.
Of course.
Thank you first.
Of course.
The most common problem which I have as a player.
Could you speak up, please?
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
The most common problem that I have as a player and a little bit as a game master is sensor overloading. Because maybe games sometimes very intense, and In the middle of the game, some people with these issues
Breakdown?
yeah, they just lay down and they can't do anything. I have the same problems too.
Yeah, like a seizure. Like a seizure.
Or like shutting down more like.
No,
Or for example, like a epilepsy, right?
No.
It's they just shut down.
They just
They should. Okay. Sorry.
Headaches,
Yeah.
such things.
Yeah, this is also something that I encountered at one of our recent games, and it was from a player who didn't tell us ahead of time that this was an issue, so we weren't prepared for it. And we had planned kind of like an arena with trials, so with lots of special effects and explosion stuff. People were informed ahead of time that there would be special effects at this game, but not like the scene wasn't described in detail. So there were a lot of things happening at once. There was a monster attacking from behind and a monster attacking from way ahead. Then there were explosions and smoke coming up, and there was a person who suffered an emotional overload. And another thing that they didn't tell us about, which would have been nice to know, was that they had a hearing impairment. So before coming to the arena, there were special effects already going off to signal that the trial was about to start. The GM or one of the NPCs was briefing the group. This person didn't hear the briefing. So there were two problems that stacked on top of each other that we as organizers could have easily catered to, but we didn't know. So this is something that I will personally also include in my sign-up sheets for the future. Do you have sensory issues that we should know about? Because otherwise I have no idea like what can trigger a person's response. And I also found out that for some people it's a problem to be in rooms with a lot of echoes. So when you have a lot of people talking in a room that is echoey, it's a problem. I had no idea. This was news to me. And it's apparently an accessibility issue that is also...
The problem is nowadays some people have these issues and they don't know yet.
Oh.
They had no diagnosis or wasn't diagnosed. From my point of observation, many of these people like to play LARPs and playing LARPs.
I had only one problem. Yes. Apart from my case, I developed a fear of heights. And usually most of our LARPs were at the new floor, so it became a problem. But shutting down the windows with blinds and made the deal. The case I want to tell you about was a bit extreme, and it shows how the LARPs 15 years ago looked like. We had a scene that was done live in a pub, in a university pub, which was open for business with people. And the scene considered kidnapping a person. Kidnapping a person by masked guys in military dress, then binding him, then putting him into the trunk of the car and driving him away. The scene was, of course, discussed with the regional commander of the police, and he sent us a squad to protect the scene. For example, to protect our guys from being victims of the hell, let's say, yes? Because those were all narrators, they weren't players. Those were all narrators, so we took the largest guys, and for the abductors, they were to be the human enforcers who abducted a vampire informer in order to force him for some confessions. The rest of the scene considered was binding him in a forest to the tree where the monster is. But it wasn't that terrible. They had to protect, if, for example, someone said, let him go or something, then the police would interfere and said there was a movie being done, because that was the magic time, the magic word at that time. There is a movie being done. So we had the narrator caught by the enforcers. He was dragged along the floor. He was screaming. He was shouting. They were pretending to hit him. They gagged him to stop him screaming, and then they flung him into the trunk. The problem was claustrophobic. So we had the guy closed in a dark trunk with a gap in the nose. So he couldn't really call for help. The only thing she could do was hit into the trunk, which was only considered great because it added to the appeal of the scene. And then he told me that those 10 minutes were the worst minutes in his life. And then he was actually shutting down. He felt that darkness, not that it was dark in the closed trunk, but let's say metaphysical darkness was closing his eyes. So that was the one thing we had, but it was quite interesting.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. We also had one of the LARP organizers who was a very experienced witch, and she was used to what is usually done with the witches, burning them. So she had everything ready, all those burnable and unburnable clothes on, because it's quite ritual. You have to wear things that are not burning, wear things that are burning, use usually Vaseline to make lines for the fire. It's something it's a stunt actually that you have to protect for. And Magda was usually doing the stunt for the people, because what the people love, burning witches, of course. And we had a problem that when she was shouting when burned, she threw herself too much, and the stake she was bound to draw her clips from her hair. So instead of we had like this, but everyone reacted very quickly, and it was done. And she was also, she thought that when you are used to being burned, let's say 10 times, the moment your hair starts on fire, it's not very good. So it was like it looked 20 years ago. My first labs were 25 years ago. It was quite different.
So I can tell. You had a story as well?
The same about claustrophobic, and person was playing the main role. It was her birthday, and many people wanted to make very happy made for her again. And one moment it was a bag put on her head, and it appeared that she has claustrophobia. It was terrible mistake, I would say. Wow.
Actually, one of the accessibility issues that I encountered at the LARP that I wasn't expecting was a financial one. And it wasn't that the LARP was so expensive, because I was prepared for this. I signed up for this LARP. I had the funds set aside. It took me a couple of months to get to this point where I could pay for this LARP. I was very happy. I got my character sheet, and then the organizer sent a form. All right, so here is the cost of the rental uniform, rental gun, rental this, rental that, and it added up to half the price of the ticket. And I was shocked, because it hadn't been communicated before that we would have any rentals necessary, or that there would be uniforms that we had to pay for. I thought that I would have to just have the random costume that I usually come with for a LARP. But no, this was something that was just kind of sprung on the players. And while for most people it wasn't an issue because they decided, well, since I already have a ticket, I'm going to just splurge on this additional stuff. For me, it was a huge problem because I didn't have all this money. I had to really like scramble for it. And also I felt a bit silly for bringing this up to the organizers because it's, I don't know if you have the same feeling, but it feels a bit humiliating, I guess, to just say, hey, so I know that I just splurged €600 for the ticket, but I can't really pay like 200 more for stuff like that. So it was painful. I managed, but I would never want to put my players in this situation. Oh, and additional cost, and this is something that also happens still, is transport to the location, which isn't communicated beforehand, that it also needs to be paid for by the participants. Because sometimes you can just assume that if it's not listed as like an additional price, it will be included in. And I've had LARPs that kind of weren't very great at separating the costs from what the organizers are covering and what the players are covering. And it was, we were made to believe that it was included, and it wasn't. And it was a lot of money on top of everything else. So, yeah, financial barriers are there as well.
Just curious, when you were informing those organizers about the additional costs, were they actually handling it well, or were like?
I didn't inform them. I just decided to bite the bullet and yeah.
One question about was it in Poland?
No, it wasn't.
Poland is a crime.
Is it?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's good
It's
to
most
know.
European countries, basically.
It was in a European country.
In the Netherlands, we would call this a hidden cost, and you would be able to just tell them, don't pay this. This is what we agreed on.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That's actually good to know. I mean, obviously, since this is a bunch of people who are doing this out of the goodness of their heart and not a for-profit organization, I wouldn't just tell them, just cover the cost for me. I'd probably just drop out of the game.
The problem is, right, like, ideally, as like creative individuals, we'd like to think that, okay, we're doing this together, we're making this situation, but the moment you start taking money from people to make something, even if you're a non-profit, you start entering into some sort of contract.
That is true.
And I know that most of us creatives are not great at handling legalese and making everything fit law-wise, right, and make everything clear to everybody. But it's really important because I have stories of law organizations that have been completely dissolved because they were sued over things they weren't making communicated, and it happens. And it also happens in other creative branches. And communicating clearly what is included, what is not included, what you expect of your participants is important because you're basically creating a contract, even if it's a small thing. That's unfortunately how it works.
Yes, I suppose there's this sweet spot between treating the organizers as kind of like a company and then treating the organizers as friends. And then you have to be somewhere in the middle to have this healthy boundary around yourself.
It also depends, right? Because like, is the organizing team I'm working with a for-profit organization? Are they a non-profit? Are they a collective? Like all these different organizations kind of work different, right? And that also has an influence on how you should treat your relationship.
Alright, so let's talk a bit about safety at LARPs. We talked about some extreme examples of claustrophobia and just people experiencing things they weren't prepared for. Have you encountered any other safety concerns at your games that you weren't prepared for as either an organizer or a player?
Short term? Only once. We had an organizer fall down from stocks from the third floor. He was preparing a gate for the team to come. He was preparing all the, it was many years ago, so there were basically strings with grants that would accompany the DD and something which was state of the art, so the smoke machine that was very high level. So he was preparing it because he needed 2 hands. That was a typical building mistake, a typical building accident, because it is always in shipyards, in sailing, in building. 1 hand for the building, the other hand for work. Yes. He was trying to scrap all those durants in the street mechanism, and he just fell through. He fell on his legs, not on his face, because if he fell on his face, he would have basically, I would say, a lethal accident, which always has problems. We never had a lethal accident during the route, but we had the student who broke a hand and a leg, but he never even thought of pushing charges because he was one of the organizers. That was one of the problems. So he was basically responsible. He was a grown-up, about 22 at the time. And he was also known for being reckless. So basically it was, I wouldn't say it was his fault, but there was a lot of his responsibility. So even if he decided to push charges, he wouldn't really manage. And we weren't criminally liable. He made jokes about it, but you know, generally a lawyer doesn't take jokes about law. He made some jokes that he would make it bad, but he never pressed the charges. Basically, the organizer wasn't organizing anything inherently dangerous. That's the Polish law. If you do something inherently dangerous, like paragliding, we had a book, learn paragliding during a weekend, and if he does it. So if you do such things, or bungee jumping, Poland had quite a few very picturesque accidents with bungee jumping. So it's very much regulated. Parachuting. Then the organizer would be liable actually for everything. But if you do normal thing, you build a portal, and one of your members does it, then the protection is relatively small. So we had one accident of that kind.
About some other kinds of safety issues, not necessarily accidents, because they happen everywhere. Have you encountered something that you weren't prepared for? Because, for instance, in my experience, the things I wasn't aware of that could be a problem were, like I said, the sensory overload, for instance, or some accessibility issues that I didn't know would be a problem. For instance, at one game, which was in a castle, it was a game with a lot of moving between locations. And it would have been nice on our side as organizers to tell people ahead of time that there would be a lot of moving around, that it wouldn't just be conversing in rooms for hours, but that they would have to take things from different locations, explore, do an investigation. And there was a player who had accessibility issues, mobility issues. And while they could move up and down the stairs, they couldn't do this at that speed and at that frequency. And we basically, unfortunately, excluded them from part of that gameplay because we didn't realize that this would be a problem. So even small things like that, I think, need to be communicated at some points before the sign up, so that people know what they are signing up for.
Yeah, but at the same time, these are also kind of things you as a player should be communicating to your organizer, right?
Yes.
Right? Because like, whilst in the ideal world, you as an organizer can communicate all of these issues to your players, the reality is that all of us are also blind to some issues that people might have, because it is not reasonable to have everything in your mind's eye, right? So if the player doesn't communicate something like this, and you didn't communicate it, then there isn't really a blame to put anywhere. There's nobody communicated.
No, it's not about the blame, it's just about the problem that you suddenly have on your hands and the dilemma, how do you deal with it? Because on the one hand, you can just keep this player in one room and have the play kind of try and come to them, which is what we did, because there was literally no other alternative. Or is there anything else that you can do? Probably not. Not at the stage of the LARP has started, the player midway through realizes that, uh-oh, well, I can no longer go up and down the stairs. Well, then I guess this is my new spot. So, what tools?
One
Yeah.
thing, did you ever had problems with violence?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it was accidental. It was never, or at least on my. I was lucky.
That's
enough.
no violence then. Violence requirements.
So it was okay. So it's. I'm not sure how to phrase it correctly. I don't think the intent behind it was to hurt someone. It was in the moment. So you know how at the workshops, whenever a game involves combat, you need to practice with people or give them a set of rules, how to like pull their punches, how to make sure that you put strength behind the blow, and in the heat of the moment, some people do that anyway. Yeah. Or we had
them over the head.
Yeah.
Stick them with the pipe.
And we had a situation at one LARP where I was a player, not an organizer, where the safety mechanics that we had there, so like the escalation and de-escalation were used to escalate the situation, and then a player misunderstood that as I can do whatever I want. And they did whatever they wanted, which was whack the other person at the top of their strength, which was a lot. And the other person just like folded. I'm not sure if that was to win or just it was a hit of the moment. And
who's lying on the floor? The opponent?
Yes, the opponent.
So you know who? The one of the working. It is usually the way it works.
So that was a problem.
An example of something like this. It wasn't my experience. I heard it from a friend that she was in the lab that actually two players were actually started fighting each other, like in brawl, in combat, personally, because they started an argue in personal, not in players. And actually, other people at first thought that they started cheering up because they thought the players were actually acting up, but they could quite quickly realize that something was wrong, and actually it wasn't a end play, it was real, right? Because two people got into argue with each other, personally, not in players.
I think you have a story as well, right?
Same things about hitting someone in the head. Even earlier in Belarus we had metal weapon marks, and then we changed it to this
Foam.
Yeah. There was one issue when this foam broken and it's metal.
Yeah, there's the core that is.
The core is not supposed to be metal. It's weapons. It's supposed to be fiberglass or.
That's true, yeah. But if somebody makes a weapon and some LARPs still allow that, then
Yeah.
To do what to Ireland, to do what to break in fiberglass.
I wouldn't want to be one of either of these things, honestly. So how can we as organizers make sure that our LARPs are as safe as possible on all fronts? What are the tools that you use or that you would like for the organizers to use to make LARPs safer?
Well, I never organized any LARPs. I'm not an organizer, but I think that sometimes you need to think about something like expect the unexpected. I know it might sound a little bit paranoid, but sometimes it can be good. I think, at least.
yesterday I gave an example of like how you should plan your logistics for LARP, and that you should I abide by is an 80-20 rule of planning 80% of whatever resource you have, be it time, be it money, be it people and location, right? Like, so you have a 20% flexibility margin you can work with. And I see too many LARPs using all their resources in planning and then coming on site and not having any time or any money or any people left to actually deal with issues that arise on site. And that, if more LARPs did that, it's like having a spare set of resources you use on things on site, then that would solve so many issues, honestly.
Yeah, in a perfect world, that would be fantastic to have like a spare crew.
Yeah, it's not always possible, obviously, but like for as much as you can accommodate, not enough LARPs do it.
We can change some actions between people, battling, for example, change to some models. When one game we have, where I was an organizer, we have a dragon, and it was NPC, and it was some damageable and by itself, and if people will start to hit it, it will be different and maybe not safe. And we changed this model with what people can do with it. It was talking and narrative model to hit it. They should not hit it actually, but to talk. It's very complicated mechanically. I can just now present it, but it plays good.
Okay, so basically remove the barrier of having people react with too much violence by just changing the mechanic completely.
Yeah.
Okay. This is also something that we tried on the local scene a few times, which actually worked. There were two different things that we changed. One was at LARP convention that I go to, which for many years, for decades even, had this rule that if somebody's running after you with a sword in the forest and they whack you, you immediately like lose your health, lose whatever. They can like kill you in the middle of the game, even if it's literally the game lasts 3 days and it's the start of the second day. You're dead, you're gone, you're an NPC now. They changed this to a mechanic that is used in many other games, which is it's the target that decides if they die or not. So they will still take the hit, they will still crawl to safety, but if they still want to stay in play, then they just have to find a medic, role play being injured. This removed a lot of those murder hobos who are just sneaking around the forest looking for people to kill for fun, because they knew that it wouldn't have any effect at all. So they would just focus more on actually, the strategy and role playing. So that was one thing that they did, and the other was changing the escalation and de-escalation mechanics and completely removing red, yellow, green. Because red, yellow, green is one of the most popular Polish safety mechanics. So red is please stop, cut the scene, which is equivalent to the word cut used on the LARP scene internationally. So we used cut instead of red. We completely removed green and we used diegetic, so in-game phrase. Is this all you've got? So if you want to escalate a scene, instead of saying green and the other person responding, yeah, green, we would say, is that all you've got? And then if you want to escalate, you would say, no, actually, that's not all I've got. Let me show you what I've got. And then you go and escalate.
Actually, that's quite more immersive.
It's way more immersive, and it's easier for people to do this in-game without thinking, okay, I want to escalate now, I need to step out of the game, go green, and yank the other person off game as well. I can do all of that in-game. And for de-escalation, we would just say, instead of saying yellow, we would say back off. And this other person will take a step back and de-escalate a little bit, or keep this thing. It's increased the level of immersion immensely, and it also helped people use the safety words, which they didn't use previously, because red, yellow, green, which comes from the king scene, doesn't really work well in LARPs if it's not practiced over and over again. And we've noticed that new players didn't use them at all. They just couldn't remember.
Also, I think that we might actually the example I wanted to give might be actually come up with the topic we actually had. So, for example, you have a more immersive way of saying red, yellow, green. Like, for example, that's all you got. Or no, hold on. But I think it needed to be not only verbally, but also with a body language. For example, stop. Like, for example, no. Why? Because there might be some people with the issues, but not a physical, for example, like we talked previously, but social. They might not understand your intentions because they have an issue with social issues, like, for example, understanding the intention. There might be some issues. For example, they don't know actually what's your intention, like, for example. I'm not saying about, like, for example, you say, no, back off. And, for example, some people might say, okay, that's a sign that I'm not sure to do anything else. And some people might not catch up with this. For example, they might go on in character too much and actually ignore it. Why? Because they have some kind of social issue that he don't see it, he don't react it, he don't like get in the head like, oh, okay, I should stop.
But then you cut. Then you use red, basically. Then you
Yeah,
cut
I know,
because
I know,
they went too far.
I know, like I said, sometimes I might take up the more extreme examples, right? But they might be so subtle more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For example.
So basically, I think my issue with all the safety mechanics is that there is never enough time to practice them to the satisfactory level.
Yeah.
Because even before the game, when you have workshops and you brief people and you give them a chance to practice them, it's still not enough time for them to get comfortable enough to imagine themselves in the situations where they may need to use it. Because you are basically preparing them for in an environment that is kind of like a, you know, an isolated, contextless room, and then it's the middle of the game and they hear the phrase and it's always a question, will it click in their head? That, is this all you've got, is that provocation, and how should I react? Yeah, that's always a problem. So yeah, if we could also add some body language thing, that would be perfect. So if you have any ideas for that, I would love to read an article at some point or just like message with you, because I'm always looking to improve safety mechanics at LARPs.
I'd like to say that from my point of view, I was at the game in Poland for the first time this year, and these workshops before the game is for me a big step towards safety.
Yeah. This is something that is, I think, or this should be a standard for all the games, to have a workshop where people don't just sit there for a briefing, they don't just listen, but they actually do stuff. So they get to practice the mechanics that will be used, or at least they are shown to them and not just talked about, which was an issue for the longest time in many of the Polish games. That you will just come to something that's called a workshop and it's a briefing. And then you spend 2.5 hours sitting and listening to someone just name all the rules for you, and you have to keep them all in your head without having any kinetic way.
I think the better way for some people, like, I don't know, for example, for me, I would actually remember it better or feel it better if actually, like you said, there were an example. So, for example, you have a workshop with a briefing discussing the rules, and also showing the examples, because I was in some meetings that were showing the example on two organizers. Okay, but also what I think might be a good idea is actually practice with every single person such interaction. See how they behave, because like I was saying previously, expect the unexpected. So, for example, during such a workshop, you would actually test such a person and see how they react, because sometimes such a person, for example, is a person that is first time in some kind of lab, and they would not even realize how they react, and they might react completely unexpected. So, very defensively or very offensively. So, this might be, so for example, a let's say behavior accreditation.
Yeah, but the problem with this, I guess, is that still it's an isolated, contextless environment. And it's not the heat of the moment, it's not, you don't have a battle behind you or the enemy who really pissed you off.
I completely understand and I know this, but what I say is you might actually catch up with something overreact. I would say.
Yeah,
So
guess.
I understand, because this is a situation of role play. So that person might say, okay, I'm just testing now. It's not a play. I'm not in the character. But sometimes you might catch up with something disturbing that might come up with such testing. That say, okay, dude, that's not acceptable. I cannot take you to the game because you behaved way too much.
This is actually a really good point, because we had a situation where back when we were doing the red, yellow, green mechanics, which it was always a problem when you want to escalate with someone, no matter what mechanic is it, how far do they escalate? Is it like a gradual thing? Or is it, when I say, is that all you've got, can you go to the extreme? And there was a player who misunderstood and it didn't click in their head that it was a gradual escalation, so you don't just grab somebody and throw them on the floor, and they grabbed somebody and they threw them on the floor immediately. While the interaction started with just a little verbal sparring, it wasn't even an argument yet, and the other person invited them to escalate, so they just grabbed them and yeeted them across the room. And we were like, whoa, okay, hold on, let's rewind a little bit, and yeah, I'll let you this.
Yeah, we had a similar problem. We had a problem in our campaign lab in the Netherlands where we had a number of players that were just being too physical and being too rough with each other. The thing where like they're not pulling their punches and like just causing people harm, and like some players were getting out of our events is better than bruised, and they had a good time, but they were very much needed a few days to recover after it. And what we did is that we made a very clear stance of keep holding people accountable and making it relatively public that we are holding people accountable for their actions. At the next event, where we had a few people who were very experienced with their bow shooting, and where because of that were shooting arrows that were like go through people's heads. Yeah. Right, they're larp arrows, but still getting hit with the larp arrow in the eye is not great. So we made it very clear that, hey, stop, please turn your bow. We'll keep it for you at headquarters, or you can have it back at the event, but we don't allow you to shoot bow anymore. And the effect that had is that people saw that, realized what was going on and why we were doing that, because it was a safety issue. And on the next event, a group, one of our player groups, decided to host a workshop on bow shooting and help out, like facilitating safe fighting, because we made a very clear example that this is what we don't want.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, And we didn't shame the person for it, right? It was not like a belligerent thing of like, oh, you shouldn't be. No. We were just like, hey, stop, right? We're taking this away. We're doing this not because we hate you, not because we want to like shame you for it, but right now what is happening is unsafe, and we want to prevent people from getting hurt. And because we did that very publicly, it made our community aware and they started taking care of each other instead of having us needing us to do that for them.